By the summer of 1940, Hitler believed he had achieved a stunning victory in Western Europe. The German Wehrmacht had crushed the French army in a matter of weeks. The British and French forces had been driven out of France at Dunkirk. German armies had conquered the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. France had surrendered on June 22, 1940. The Nazi dictator stood triumphant as the master of continental Europe. Now he expected that Britain would come to terms with German power and agree to a negotiated peace. Hitler believed that Britain, cut off from its European allies and facing the full might of the German military, would recognize the hopelessness of its position and sue for peace. The German High Command was so confident in this expectation that they began constructing victory parades in Berlin to celebrate the triumphant return of German soldiers. Military planners started preparations for converting barges into invasion craft. Hitler issued orders for the German military to prepare for the possibility of an invasion of Britain if the British refused to surrender. Yet Hitler still hoped that the British would see reason and accept the reality of German military superiority. He believed that Britain had no choice but to come to terms with Nazi Germany. Hitler decided to make one more appeal to British common sense before resorting to military force against the British Isles. On July 19, 1940, Hitler addressed the German Reichstag with what would become known as his final peace offer to Britain. This was a calculated attempt to convince the British people and their government to accept defeat and agree to a negotiated peace. Hitler did not want to have to invade Britain or to wage a prolonged war against the British nation. Such a campaign would be costly and uncertain. Hitler believed that by offering reasonable peace terms to Britain, he could convince the British leadership to surrender without the necessity of military invasion. Hitler spoke to the Reichstag as the commander of a victorious military machine that had defeated all enemies arrayed against it. He wanted the British to understand that further resistance was futile. He wanted them to recognize that Hitler was offering them a face-saving way to exit the war with their honor intact. In his July 19 speech, Hitler addressed the Reichstag members and presented what he called an appeal to reason to Great Britain. Hitler stated that he did not wish to see the destruction of the British Empire. He claimed that he had never desired to conquer Britain or to reduce Britain to a subservient status within a German-controlled Europe. Hitler said that it had never been his intention or his aim to destroy the British Empire. Instead, Hitler proposed that Britain could maintain its empire if it simply accepted German dominance over Europe. Germany would control continental Europe, while Britain could retain its overseas empire. This arrangement would benefit both nations according to Hitler's calculation. Hitler believed that this was a reasonable proposal that any rational British leader should accept. The German dictator was confident that the British government would recognize the wisdom of his offer. He was certain that British statesmen would see that resistance to Germany was pointless and that accepting German peace terms was the only sensible course of action. Hitler reminded the British of his previous peace offers. He recalled his speech of October 6, 1939, in which he had held out his hand to both France and Britain. At that time, Hitler claimed to have been convinced of German military superiority and confident of ultimate victory. Yet he had still attempted to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Hitler said that his hand had been rejected and that all his peace offers had been rebuffed by British leaders. The British had refused every opportunity for a negotiated peace. Now Hitler was making what he called his last appeal to reason. He was giving Britain one final chance to accept peace terms and avoid the terrible destruction that would come if Germany had to conquer Britain by force. Hitler wanted the British to understand the magnitude of what was at stake. If Britain continued to resist, the result would be the total destruction of the British nation. Hitler warned that if his appeal to reason was rejected, Germany would have no choice but to use all the military force at its disposal to crush British resistance. Hitler declared that Germany would not be weakened by a prolonged war with Britain. He proclaimed that German supplies of food, fuel, raw materials, and manufactured goods were adequate for a long conflict. Germany had captured vast territories in Poland and France from which it could draw resources. Germany had access to supplies from Romania and other allied nations. Hitler stated that Germany had reserves of materials sufficient to wage war for as long as was necessary. The German military machine had grown stronger, not weaker, since the beginning of the war. German factories were producing weapons and military equipment in enormous quantities. German soldiers had been hardened by their victories in Poland and France. Hitler wanted the British to understand that any attempt to defeat Germany through a prolonged war would be impossible. Germany had the resources and the industrial capacity to wage war indefinitely. Britain, by contrast, would eventually exhaust its resources and be forced to surrender. Hitler warned the British not to interpret his peace offer as a sign of weakness or doubt on Germany's part. Hitler explicitly stated that Churchill might claim that the German offer of peace showed fear or hesitation on Germany's side, but Hitler insisted that this was not the case. Germany was not offering peace from weakness but from strength. Germany had already defeated all enemies in continental Europe. Germany had achieved air superiority and naval advantages. Germany was offering peace as a victor to a defeated enemy, not as a nation seeking relief from a difficult war. Hitler was trying to convince the British that accepting his peace terms would not mean surrendering to an equal power, but rather submitting to an overwhelmingly superior force. Hitler believed that if the British understood the true balance of military power, they would recognize that resistance was futile. Hitler spoke about the horrors of continued warfare and the unnecessary suffering that would result if Britain refused to accept peace. He expressed regret that the war would cause casualties among British civilians as well as German soldiers. Hitler said that he genuinely wished to avoid the destruction and suffering that another military campaign would bring. Yet Hitler also made clear that Germany was prepared to wage war against Britain and would do so without hesitation if necessary. He stated that millions of young German soldiers were eager to fight against Britain. Germany had the military resources and the will to conduct a full-scale campaign against the British Isles. All German forces would be directed toward the destruction of British military capability and British resistance. Hitler was drawing a contrast between what he was offering, which was peace with honor, and what Britain would face if it refused his offer, which was total destruction and utter defeat. In the weeks following his July speech, Hitler waited for a British response to his peace offer. But the response that came was not one of acceptance or even serious consideration. Instead, Churchill and the British government flatly rejected Hitler's offer. Churchill refused to enter into any negotiations with Germany. The British government declared that they would continue fighting until Nazi Germany was completely defeated. This was a shocking development to Hitler. He had expected that Britain, faced with military overwhelming superiority on the German side, would see reason and accept peace terms. He had believed that the British leadership would recognize that continued resistance was futile. But instead of surrendering, Britain had defiantly rejected his offer and had reaffirmed its commitment to fighting Germany to the end. This rejection infuriated Hitler and demonstrated to him that Churchill and the British people would not be swayed by appeals to reason or offers of compromise. When the British refused to surrender and rejected his peace offer, Hitler turned to military means to force British submission. He ordered the Luftwaffe to launch a massive air offensive against Britain designed to achieve two purposes. First, the German Air Force would attempt to destroy the British Royal Air Force and gain air superiority over the British Isles. Second, the air campaign would weaken British morale by bombing civilian targets and infrastructure. Hitler believed that if the Luftwaffe could defeat the RAF, and if German bombing could terrorize the British population, then Britain would eventually be forced to capitulate. Hitler ordered the preparation of Operation Sea Lion, which was the code name for the planned German invasion of Britain. If the air campaign succeeded in breaking British resistance, then an invasion would not be necessary. If the air campaign failed to produce surrender, then the invasion would proceed. Hitler was determined that one way or another, Britain would come to terms with Germany. The Battle of Britain, which followed Hitler's rejection of British surrender, was one of the most significant military campaigns of World War II. German bombers and fighters attacked British cities, towns, airfields, and ports. The Luftwaffe flew thousands of sorties against British targets. German bombs fell on London, Coventry, Liverpool, and other British cities. Civilians were killed in bombing raids. British homes and factories were destroyed. But despite the ferocity of the German air campaign, British resistance did not crumble. The British people displayed remarkable courage and determination. British fighter pilots fought desperately against German aircraft. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered at times, managed to inflict heavy losses on German aircraft and pilots. By the autumn of 1940, it became clear that the Luftwaffe could not achieve air superiority over Britain. German losses of aircraft and trained pilots were mounting. The RAF continued to defend British airspace. It became apparent to Hitler and the German High Command that an invasion of Britain would be extremely difficult if the Luftwaffe did not have air superiority. As German air losses mounted and it became clear that the Luftwaffe could not defeat the RAF, Hitler began to lose confidence in the ability to force Britain into submission through air power alone. The German dictator had expected a quick victory over British air forces. He had believed that the RAF would be overwhelmed by the numerical superiority and fighting power of the Luftwaffe. But the RAF had proven to be a worthy opponent. British fighter pilots were skilled and brave. British radar technology gave the RAF a crucial advantage in detecting and intercepting German aircraft. German bombers proved to be more vulnerable than expected. Trained German pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The German aircraft industry, though large, could not keep pace with German losses. Hitler realized that the air campaign against Britain was not achieving the decisive victory that he had anticipated. The British people had not been terrorized into submission by bombing. Instead, they had become more determined to resist. By the end of September 1940, Hitler decided to postpone the invasion of Britain indefinitely. The German dictator recognized that without air superiority, an invasion of Britain would be too risky. An amphibious assault against a defended coastline would be extremely costly even if the Germans had air superiority. Without air superiority, such an operation would be suicidal. German naval forces were too weak to protect an invasion fleet against the British Royal Navy. German troops landing on British beaches would be vulnerable to British counterattack and could potentially be forced back into the sea. Hitler was not willing to risk such a disaster. Instead, he ordered the Luftwaffe to continue bombing British cities and targets, but accepted that an invasion of Britain was not immediately feasible. Hitler began to think instead about his long-term strategic goals, which included the conquest of the Soviet Union and the acquisition of vast territories in Eastern Europe. Hitler's response to Britain's refusal to surrender underwent a significant transformation as the Battle of Britain progressed and German air power proved inadequate to force British submission. What had begun as an appeal to reason followed by attempts to achieve military victory through air power now gave way to a strategy of attrition and a blockade. Germany would attempt to strangle Britain economically through a submarine blockade and surface raiders that would attack British shipping. German bombers would continue to attack British cities and infrastructure to damage the British economy and reduce civilian morale. But Hitler no longer believed that Germany could achieve a decisive military victory against Britain in the near term. The German dictator now accepted that Britain would continue to resist. This realization gradually pushed Hitler toward his true strategic objective, which was the invasion and conquest of the Soviet Union. Hitler had always believed that his destiny lay in Eastern Europe. The struggle with Britain was an impediment to his ultimate goals. If he could not quickly defeat Britain through air power, then he would focus his attention and his military resources on the Soviet Union. In December 1940, Hitler delivered a speech to the workers of Berlin in which he reflected on Germany's continued struggle against British resistance. Hitler reiterated that Germany would never surrender and that Germany would ultimately be victorious regardless of how long the war continued. Hitler declared that Germany possessed all the resources necessary to wage war indefinitely. He stated that neither military force, economic pressure, nor time itself would force Germany to surrender. Whatever happened, Germany would emerge as the victor in this struggle. Hitler asserted that he was not a man who gave up on struggles that he had begun. He pointed to his life history as proof that he possessed the determination and the will to overcome all obstacles. Hitler emphasized that German soldiers and the German people must understand that this would be a long war, but that German victory was certain. Hitler wanted to maintain German morale and determination even though the expected quick victory over Britain had not materialized. Hitler's frustration with British refusal to surrender was evident in his speeches and public statements. Throughout 1940 and 1941, the German dictator had expected that Britain would behave like France and accept defeat when faced with German military superiority. But Churchill and the British people had shown a different spirit. They had refused to surrender despite facing what appeared to be overwhelming odds. They had continued to resist despite German bombing and blockade. This British defiance was something that Hitler had not anticipated and did not understand. He viewed it as irrational and self-destructive. From Hitler's perspective, continuing to fight Germany was pointless. Germany was too strong militarily and economically. Britain could not defeat Germany. The only rational response was to accept German terms and end the war. Yet the British had chosen a different path. They had chosen to continue fighting even though the prospects for victory seemed dim. By the spring of 1941, Hitler's attention was increasingly focused on his plans to invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was scheduled to begin in June 1941. This invasion of the Soviet Union represented what Hitler believed to be his true historic mission. The conquest of Eastern Europe and the acquisition of vast territories in Russia and Ukraine was central to Hitler's ideology and his vision for a greater Germanic empire. The continued British resistance, while frustrating to Hitler, was no longer his primary concern. Germany could continue the air war and the blockade against Britain, but the decisive struggle in Hitler's mind now lay in the East. When Germany defeated the Soviet Union, Hitler believed that Britain would eventually be forced to surrender. With the Soviet Union conquered, Britain would face a Germany that controlled all of continental Europe and possessed vast new resources from Russian territory. In this situation, British continued resistance would be truly futile. Hitler's response to Britain's refusal to surrender demonstrated the limits of Nazi military power and the strength of British determination. Hitler had expected that reason and military overwhelming superiority would convince the British to accept peace. When they refused, Hitler attempted to use air power to force British capitulation. When that failed, Hitler was forced to accept that Britain would continue to resist. This recognition that Britain could not be quickly defeated represented a significant strategic setback for Nazi Germany. It meant that Germany would have to wage a prolonged war on multiple fronts, something that Hitler had wished to avoid. The British refusal to surrender also ensured that Britain would eventually become the base for American military power in Europe. The United States would enter the war in December 1941. American industrial production and American military power would be mobilized in support of Britain. With American resources now added to the struggle against Germany, the balance of power would gradually shift away from Germany and toward the Allies. In his latest speeches and reflections, Hitler expressed anger and frustration about the refusal of the British to surrender. In a speech in November 1942, Hitler stated that he had made peace offers to Britain in 1939 and again in 1940. Both offers had been rejected. Hitler said that when the British rejected his peace offer in 1940, the matter was settled in his mind. Every offer of peace was interpreted by the British as weakness, Hitler claimed, and therefore peace offers were counterproductive. From that moment forward, Hitler declared, there would be no more peace offers. The case was closed. The only course remaining was to fight to the bitter end. There was no possibility of compromise or negotiated settlement. Either Germany would win the war or Germany would lose it. Hitler made clear that he was prepared to fight to the end rather than to surrender or to accept any settlement that did not represent total German victory. The ultimate consequences of Britain's refusal to surrender and Hitler's inability to force British capitulation extended far beyond the immediate military struggle of 1940 and 1941. Britain's continued resistance ensured that there would be a base for eventual Allied operations against Nazi-controlled Europe. Britain's refusal to surrender kept alive the hope that Nazi tyranny could eventually be defeated. Britain provided a staging ground for the invasion of North Africa and eventually for the invasion of continental Europe on D-Day. Without Britain's continued resistance, without Churchill's defiant refusal to accept Hitler's offers of peace and German military superiority, the war might have ended very differently. Hitler might have been able to consolidate his power over Europe and to pursue his invasion of the Soviet Union without the necessity of defending against a hostile Britain in his rear. The outcome of World War II and the course of the 20th century might have been dramatically altered if Britain had surrendered in 1940. Hitler's response to Britain's refusal to surrender stands as a pivotal moment in World War II and in human history. The German dictator had calculated that military power and reasonable offers of peace would force the British to accept German dominance. When both military power and diplomatic appeals failed, Hitler was forced to confront a reality that he had not anticipated. Some nations and some peoples would choose to fight against overwhelming odds rather than accept surrender and subjugation. This British defiance in the face of German military superiority demonstrated that the human spirit of freedom and resistance could not be broken by force alone. It showed that peoples fighting for their independence and their survival would continue to resist even when the immediate prospects for victory seemed impossible. Britain's stand against Nazi Germany in 1940 inspired resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. It demonstrated that Nazi conquest was not inevitable. It proved that the Nazis could be opposed and that opposition, though costly, was possible. The story of Britain's refusal to surrender to Hitler's appeals and military pressure remains one of the great moral and historical moments of the 20th century.